Jake Morrison stood on the wooden platform at Willowbrook Station, his best hat in his weathered hands and his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street. He had been waiting for 3 hours, watching every face that stepped off the eastbound train, hoping to see the woman who had agreed to become his wife. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell was supposed to arrive on the 2 o'clock train from St. Louis. Her letters had been filled with elegant handwriting and gentle words about starting fresh in the Western Territories. She had described herself as a schoolteacher, 24 years old, with brown hair and kind eyes. Jake had written back about his ranch, his loneliness, and his desperate need for a partner to help build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful land. The train wheezed and coughed as it prepared to continue its journey westward. Jake approached the conductor, a thin man with a silver pocket watch who seemed to know every passenger by name. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said, his voice hoarse from the dust and nerves. "I'm looking for a lady passenger, Sarah Hartwell. She was supposed to get off here." The conductor checked his passenger list twice, running his finger down the names with careful precision. "No Hartwell on today's manifest, Cowboy. You sure about the date?" Jake pulled out the letter he had read so many times the paper was soft as cloth. "She said she'd be on the afternoon train, October 15th. That's today, isn't it?" "It is indeed. Maybe she missed her connection in Kansas City. Happens more often than you'd think. Trains don't always run on time, especially coming from the east." As the train pulled away with a great cloud of black smoke and a long, mournful whistle, Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had sold his best horses to pay for Sarah's train fare and to buy supplies for their wedding. He had cleaned his small ranch house until it sparkled, planted flower seeds near the front porch, and even bought real glass windows to replace the oiled paper that had covered the openings since he built the place. Walking back toward his horse, Jake tried to convince himself that the conductor was right. Trains were unreliable. Sarah would probably arrive tomorrow or the day after, but deep in his heart, he felt the familiar ache of disappointment that had followed him since childhood. People left. People didn't come. People promised things they had no intention of keeping. His ranch lay 15 miles south of Willowbrook, in a valley where Willow Creek cut through stands of cottonwood and aspen trees. Jake had built everything himself over the past 5 years, starting with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his grandfather. The house was modest but solid, with thick log walls and a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly even on the windiest days. He raised cattle and horses, selling them to the army post at Fort Crawford and to travelers heading further west. The work was hard and lonely. Jake woke before dawn every day to feed the animals, mend fences, and handle the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. In the evenings, he sat on his porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains, wondering if he would spend the rest of his life talking only to his horses and the occasional visitor who stopped for a meal and directions. That was why he had placed an advertisement in the St. Louis newspaper, describing himself honestly as a rancher seeking a wife to share the challenges and rewards of frontier life. Sarah's response had been the only one that seemed genuine. She wrote about wanting to escape the crowded, sooty city for clean air and open spaces. She said she was tired of teaching other people's children when she longed to have her own family. Jake had written back immediately, and their correspondence had continued for 4 months. He learned that Sarah had grown up on a small farm before her family moved to the city after her father's death. She knew how to cook, sew, and manage a household. More importantly, her letters revealed a sense of humor and an adventurous spirit that Jake found deeply appealing. Now, as he rode home through the golden afternoon light, Jake wondered if he had been fooling himself. Maybe Sarah had never intended to come west. Maybe she had been writing to several men, playing some kind of cruel game, or maybe something had happened to her. The thought struck him like a physical blow. What if Sarah had started her journey but encountered trouble along the way? Train robberies were not uncommon, and a young woman traveling alone would be vulnerable to all kinds of dangers. Jake had heard stories of passengers being robbed, kidnapped, or worse during the long journey across the plains. By the time he reached his ranch, Jake had worked himself into a state of genuine worry. He spent the evening packing his porch and writing a letter to the railroad company, asking for information about any incidents involving eastbound passengers. He also wrote to the sheriff in Kansas City, requesting help in locating Sarah Hartwell. 3 days passed with no word. Jake rode to Willowbrook each afternoon to check for telegrams, but none came. On the fourth day, he received a letter from the railroad company stating that they had no record of Sarah Hartwell purchasing a ticket for any date in October. The letter was polite but final, suggesting that Jake might have been the victim of some kind of confidence scheme. The news hit Jake harder than he expected, not just because his dreams of marriage and family had been crushed, but because it forced him to confront the possibility that he had been completely wrong about Sarah's character. Had her letters been lies? Had she been laughing at the lonely cowboy who believed her pretty words? Jake threw himself into ranch work with desperate energy, repairing fences that didn't need fixing and organizing his barn until every tool had its perfect place. He told himself that he was better off alone, that he had been stupid to trust someone he had never met. But late at night, lying in his narrow bed and listening to the coyotes sing in the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. 2 weeks after Sarah's scheduled arrival, Jake was riding his northern boundary when he noticed buzzards circling in the sky about a mile from his property line. The large black birds wheeled and dipped in the distinctive pattern that meant they had found something dead or dying. Jake normally would have assumed it was a deer or elk that had fallen to wolves or disease, but something made him turn his horse toward the circling scavengers. The terrain grew rougher as he approached the area, with rocky outcroppings and thick stands of pine trees that provided perfect cover for predators or outlaws. Jake had avoided this section of land when he was choosing his ranch location, partly because it was difficult to work, and partly because it felt somehow ominous, like a place where bad things happened. As he drew closer to the buzzards, Jake began to smell something that made his stomach turn. It was the sweet, sick odor of death, but mixed with something else. Smoke, very faint, as if a fire had burned out days ago, but still detectable to someone who had spent years reading the subtle signs of the wilderness. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a sturdy pine tree, then made his way carefully through the underbrush toward the source of the smell. The buzzards scattered reluctantly as he approached, their wings making harsh, angry sounds in the quiet air. What Jake found made his blood run cold. The remains of a wagon lay scattered across a small clearing, its wooden sides splintered and charred. Pieces of clothing and personal belongings were strewn among the wreckage, and Jake could see bones that were clearly human among the debris. But what drew his attention was a piece of blue fabric caught on a nearby branch, fluttering in the breeze like a desperate signal. Jake approached the fabric carefully, his heart pounding. It was good quality cotton, the kind a respectable woman might wear for traveling. As he examined it more closely, he noticed that it had been torn, not cut, and there were dark stains on it that could have been blood. Searching the area more thoroughly, Jake found other clues that painted a terrifying picture. Wagon tracks led into the clearing from the east, following what appeared to be a game trail that would have been difficult for anyone unfamiliar with the area to navigate. The tracks showed that the wagon had been moving slowly, as if the driver was lost or being cautious. Near the burned wagon, Jake found a small leather journal, its pages scattered and damaged but still partially readable. His hands shook as he gathered the pages and tried to piece together what they said. The handwriting was feminine and educated, and some of the entries were dated from early October. October 8th left Kansas City this morning. The train was delayed, but I finally secured passage to Denver. From there, I must find transportation to Willowbrook. The conductor says it will be challenging, but I am determined to reach Jake before he thinks I have abandoned our plans. October 10th missed the connection in Denver due to a washout on the tracks. Found a wagon driver who claims to know a shortcut to Willowbrook. He seems rough but honest, and several other passengers vouch for his reliability. We leave at dawn. October 12th, something is wrong. The driver took us far from the main road, claiming it would be faster. We have been traveling through wilderness for 2 days, and I fear we are lost. The other passengers are growing anxious, and there is talk of turning back. The journal entries ended there, but Jake had read enough to understand what had happened. Sarah had never intended to deceive him. She had been trying to reach Willowbrook when she fell victim to criminals who preyed on travelers taking the supposedly safer wagon routes through the mountains. Jake spent the rest of the day searching the area for more clues, hopping desperately to find some sign that Sarah had survived the attack. The remains he had found were too damaged to identify, and there were clear signs that animals had been scavenging the scene for days or weeks. But the fact that Sarah's journal had survived gave him hope that she might have escaped into the wilderness. As the sun began to set, Jake made a decision that would change the course of his life. He could not simply return to his ranch and accept that Sarah was dead. He had to search for her, even if the chances of finding her alive were slim. The journal entries suggested that the attack had occurred nearly 2 weeks ago, but Jake knew that people could survive in the wilderness for long periods if they had the knowledge and determination. That night, Jake rode back to his ranch and prepared for an extended search. He packed supplies for 2 weeks, including extra ammunition, medical supplies, and warm clothing. He also wrote a letter to the sheriff in Willowbrook, describing what he had found and requesting help in investigating the attack on the wagon train. As dawn broke over the mountains, Jake set out from his ranch with a pack horse and provisions for a long journey. He had no idea where to search for Sarah, or even if she was still alive, but he knew he could not live with himself if he did not try. The woman who had written those letters deserved someone to look for her, someone to care about what had happened to her. Jake had spent 5 years building a ranch in the wilderness, learning to read tracks and signs that most people would never notice. Now he would use those skills to search for a woman he had never met, but whom he had already come to love through her letters. Whether he found Sarah alive, dead, or not at all, Jake Morrison was determined to learn the truth about what had happened to the mail-order bride who had tried so hard to reach him. The morning air was crisp and clean as Jake rode back toward the site of the attack, studying the ground for any clue he might have missed the day before. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Colorado Territory, a woman might be fighting to stay alive, waiting for someone to find her and bring her home. Jake intended to be that someone, no matter how long it took or how dangerous the search became. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the shallow cave and tried to control her shivering. 18 days had passed since the attack on the wagon train, 18 days of hiding, running, and struggling to survive in the unforgiving wilderness. Her traveling dress hung in tatters around her thin frame, and her once neat brown hair now fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. The cave was barely deep enough to shelter her from the wind, but it was hidden behind a curtain of wild grapevines that provided some concealment from anyone who might be searching for her. Sarah had learned to be invisible during these long weeks, moving only at dawn and dusk, sleeping in whatever shelter she could find, and living on berries, roots, and the occasional fish she managed to catch with her bare hands. Her stomach cramped with hunger as she nibbled on the last of the wild rose hips she had gathered the day before. The sweet tart flavor reminded her of the jam her mother used to make back in Missouri, and for a moment Sarah allowed herself to remember the warmth of her childhood kitchen, the smell of fresh bread baking, and the sound of her mother's gentle humming. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. The refined schoolteacher who had boarded the train in St. Louis with such high hopes and carefully packed trunks had died in that terrible clearing where the bandits attacked their wagon. What remained was something harder and more desperate, a creature of pure survival instinct who had learned to move through the forest like a wild animal. Sarah touched the small leather journal hidden in the torn pocket of her dress, grateful that she had managed to save it during her frantic escape. The journal contained not just her own thoughts and experiences, but also copies of every letter she had received from Jake Morrison. Those letters had sustained her through the darkest moments of her ordeal, reminding her that somewhere in this vast territory, a good man was waiting for her. Jake's letters had painted a picture of a life Sarah desperately wanted. He wrote about sunrise over the mountains, about building something lasting with his own hands, about the satisfaction of honest work and simple pleasures. His words revealed a man who was lonely but not bitter, strong but not harsh, someone who understood the value of partnership in facing life's challenges. The memory of those letters had kept Sarah moving when every muscle in her body screamed for her to lie down and give up. They had given her the strength to learn which berries were safe to eat, which streams provided the cleanest water, and how to build small fires that would not create enough smoke to attract attention. The attack itself remained a nightmare that visited Sarah every time she closed her eyes. The wagon train had consisted of 6 passengers and a driver who claimed to know a faster route to the western settlements. For the first 2 days, the journey had seemed routine, if somewhat rougher than Sarah had expected. On the 3rd day, the driver had led them into increasingly remote terrain, claiming that the main roads were washed out by recent rains. Sarah had begun to feel uneasy, especially when she noticed that the other passengers seemed to know each other in ways that suggested they were not fellow travelers but accomplices. Her suspicions were confirmed when they stopped for the night in a secluded clearing. As Sarah pretended to sleep in the back of the wagon, she overheard hushed conversations about splitting the take and cleaning up loose ends. She realized with growing horror that she had fallen into the hands of criminals who preyed on unsuspecting travelers. When the attack began just before dawn, Sarah was already awake and alert. The supposed passengers turned on each other with shocking violence, fighting over strongboxes and valuables that Sarah had not even known were aboard the wagon. In the chaos, a lantern was overturned and the wagon caught fire, creating confusion and panic that Sarah used to her advantage. She had slipped away into the underbrush while the criminals were distracted by their fight, taking only her small travel bag and the clothes on her back. Behind her, the sounds of violence continued for what felt like hours, punctuated by screams and gunshots that echoed through the mountains like thunder. For the first week after the attack, Sarah had stayed close to the scene, hoping that legitimate authorities might arrive to investigate. But no one came, and she gradually realized that she was completely on her own in the wilderness. The criminals had chosen their ambush site well, far from any traveled road or settlement. Sarah had received some outdoor education during her farm childhood, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of surviving alone in the Colorado wilderness. She made countless mistakes in those first days, drinking from stagnant pools that made her violently ill, eating unfamiliar plants that caused painful stomach cramps, and building fires that filled her hiding places with choking smoke. But Sarah was intelligent and adaptable, and she learned quickly from each mistake. She discovered that clear, running water was safer than still pools, and that she could test unfamiliar plants by rubbing small amounts on her skin before tasting them. She learned to build tiny fires in natural windbreaks that dispersed smoke safely, and to extinguish them completely before moving to a new hiding place. Most importantly, Sarah learned to think like prey rather than predator. She avoided open spaces where she could be seen from a distance, traveled along ridgelines where her footprints would not show, and never stayed in the same shelter for more than 2 nights. These precautions proved wise when she spotted riders searching the area during her second week in the wilderness. The men were clearly looking for something or someone, moving in organized patterns and examining the ground carefully for tracks. Sarah watched them from her hiding place in a thicket of mountain laurel, her heart pounding as she recognized the rough clothing and hard faces of criminals. They were probably survivors from the attack who wanted to make sure no witnesses remained alive. For 3 terrifying days, the searchers combed the area around the attack site, sometimes passing within yards of Sarah's hiding places. She survived by remaining perfectly still for hours at a time, breathing slowly and quietly while the men called to each other and discussed their search strategy. On the 3rd evening, Sarah heard them arguing about whether to continue the search or give up and head for safer territory. One man insisted that any survivor would have died of exposure by now, while another argued that they could not afford to leave potential witnesses alive. "The girl's probably wolf food by now," the first man said. "We've been searching for days without finding a trace. She's either dead or so far away it doesn't matter." "She was educated," the second man replied. "Could write, could describe us to the law, that makes her dangerous." "Dead women don't write descriptions," the first man said with a laugh that chilled Sarah's blood. "And live women don't survive 3 weeks alone out here. Let's get back to civilization before someone starts wondering where we've been." The next morning, Sarah watched the riders disappear toward the east, but she waited another full day before emerging from her hiding place. The conversation she had overheard told her 2 important things. The men believed she would die without their intervention, and they were heading back toward more settled areas where they felt safe. This knowledge gave Sarah new determination to survive and eventually find her way to civilization where she could report the crimes she had witnessed. But first, she had to learn how to live long enough to make that journey possible. As October turned into November, Sarah developed routines and skills that kept her alive despite the approaching winter. She learned to identify edible roots and nuts, to catch small fish in shallow streams, and to find natural shelters that provided protection from wind and rain. She also began moving systematically westward, hopping to eventually find a settlement or traveled road. Sarah's greatest fear was not starvation or exposure, but the possibility that she would never be found by anyone who cared about her welfare. She thought constantly about Jake Morrison, wondering if he had given up hope of her arrival or if he might still be looking for her. His letters had described him as a man of strong character and determination, but would even such a man continue searching for a woman who had seemingly vanished without a trace? The journal helped Sarah maintain her sanity during the long, cold nights. She wrote detailed accounts of her experiences, partly as a record of what had happened to her, and partly as a way of processing the trauma of her ordeal. Writing reminded her that she was still Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, educated woman and former schoolteacher, not just a desperate creature struggling to survive. She also reread Jake's letters by moonlight, memorizing every detail about his ranch, his hopes, and his character. These letters had become more precious to her than food or shelter, representing not just her past hopes but her determination to survive long enough to build a future with a man who seemed to understand the true meaning of commitment. As November progressed, Sarah began to see signs that she was moving toward more settled territory. She found old blazes on trees that suggested logging activity, and occasionally discovered the remains of campfires that were too organized to have been made by her criminal pursuers. One morning, Sarah woke to find fresh horse tracks near the stream where she had been gathering water. The tracks were different from those left by the criminals who had searched for her weeks earlier. These were made by a single horse carrying a heavy load, and the tracks showed that the rider had dismounted to examine the ground carefully, like someone looking for specific signs rather than hunting randomly. Sarah's heart began to race with a mixture of hope and terror. Could this be someone sent to find her, or was it another threat to her safety? She studied the tracks more carefully, noting details that her weeks in the wilderness had taught her to read. The horse was well shod and well fed, suggesting an owner who took good care of his animals. The tracks showed no signs of urgency or aggression, just methodical searching behavior. Most importantly, the rider had taken time to water his horse and check the surrounding area for signs, behavior that suggested someone genuinely looking for a missing person rather than hunting prey. Sarah made a decision that required all her courage. Instead of hiding from this new searcher, she would try to determine his intentions and possibly make contact if he seemed trustworthy. After weeks of running and hiding, she was ready to take the risk of revealing herself to someone who might be able to help her reach safety. But first, she needed to prepare herself for human contact. Sarah used the cold stream water to wash her face and hands as best she could, and braided her tangled hair into something resembling respectability. She also rehearsed what she would say if the opportunity arose to identify herself and explain her situation. As she prepared to leave her latest hiding place, Sarah offered a silent prayer for strength and wisdom. Somewhere out there, a rider was searching for something or someone. With luck and courage, that someone might be her, and the rider might be her salvation rather than her doom. The morning sun filtered through the pine branches as Sarah began moving carefully toward the area where she had seen the horse tracks. After 18 days of hiding, she was about to take the greatest risk of her ordeal, trusting another human being with her life. Jake Morrison crouched beside the small stream, studying the faint impressions in the soft mud with the intensity of a man reading scripture. 5 days of searching had yielded frustratingly few clues, but these tracks were different. They were smaller than anything made by the criminals who had attacked the wagon train, and they showed a distinctive wear pattern that suggested someone who had been walking for weeks rather than riding. More importantly, the tracks showed behavior that seemed almost human in its intelligence. The person had approached the water carefully, testing the bank before committing their full weight. They had drunk from the cleanest part of the stream, avoiding areas where animals had mudded the water. They had even covered their tracks afterward, using a broken branch to sweep away the most obvious signs of their presence. Jake's heart began to pound as he realized what he was seeing. Someone was alive out here, someone with enough knowledge and determination to survive for weeks in the wilderness. Someone who was being careful to avoid detection, which suggested they had good reason to fear discovery. Could it possibly be Sarah? Jake had been searching for 5 days now, following every possible escape route from the attack site and checking every cave, thicket, and shelter where a desperate person might take refuge. He had found plenty of evidence that someone had been living rough in the area, but most of it was old or ambiguous. These tracks were fresh, made within the past day or two. Rising from his crouch, Jake looked around the area with new attention. If someone was hiding nearby, they would choose a spot with good visibility, multiple escape routes, and natural protection from the weather. His eyes settled on a rocky outcropping about a quarter mile upstream, where a stand of thick pine trees offered concealment, and the elevation would provide a clear view of approaching danger. Instead of heading directly toward the rocks, Jake made a careful circuit of the area, looking for more signs and trying to determine if he was being watched. His years of hunting and tracking had taught him to think like both predator and prey, and right now he needed to convince a frightened person that he was not a threat. Near the base of the rocky outcropping, Jake found more evidence that someone had been living in the area. Tiny fragments of cloth caught on branches, ashes from carefully concealed fires, and the remains of a fish cleaned with something sharp and precise. Most telling of all, he found a small pile of rose hip seeds, still fresh enough to suggest they had been eaten recently. Jake knew that most people would not recognize rose hips as edible, much less know how to prepare them safely. This suggested someone with real knowledge of wilderness survival, or someone who had learned through desperate trial and error. The careful way the seeds had been saved and buried also showed the kind of methodical thinking that characterized all the signs he had been following. Settling himself against a large pine tree where he would be visible but not threatening, Jake began to speak in a clear, carrying voice that would reach anyone hiding in the rocks above. "My name is Jake Morrison. I own a ranch about 15 miles south of here. I'm looking for a lady named Sarah Hartwell who was supposed to meet me in Willowbrook 3 weeks ago. If anyone can hear me, I mean no harm. I'm here to help." Jake waited, listening to the wind in the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk circling high overhead. He repeated his message twice more, then settled down to wait with the patience of a man accustomed to dealing with frightened animals. An hour passed before Jake heard the first sound that might have been human rather than animal. It was just a small rustle of movement from somewhere above him, but it had the quality of someone trying very hard to move quietly. Jake continued to sit still, occasionally speaking Sarah's name and his own, but making no aggressive moves toward the hiding place. Finally, a voice called down from the rocks, so faint that Jake almost missed it over the sound of the wind. "How do you know that name?" The voice was definitely female, hoarse and weak, but unmistakably educated. Jake's heart leaped with hope and relief. After days of searching and weeks of worry, he had finally found her. "Sarah, is that you? I've been looking everywhere for you." A long silence followed, and Jake began to worry that he had scared her back into hiding. Then the voice came again, stronger this time, but still cautious. "Prove you're Jake Morrison. Tell me something only Jake would know." Jake smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Even after weeks of surviving in the wilderness, Sarah was being smart about her safety. He thought quickly about details from their correspondence that would convince her of his identity. "In your first letter, you told me about teaching children in a one-room schoolhouse near the river. You said your favorite student was a little girl named Emma who reminded you of yourself at that age. You also said you missed the open sky and fresh air of the farm where you grew up." Another pause, then Jake heard the sound of someone moving carefully down the rocky slope. She was being cautious, probably checking to make sure he was alone and not armed. Jake kept his hands visible and his voice calm. "In my letter about the ranch, I told you about my horse Buck and how I built the house myself using timber from my own land. I also told you about watching the sunset from my front porch and wishing I had someone to share it with." When Sarah finally emerged from her hiding place, Jake barely recognized her as the refined woman he had imagined from her letters. Her traveling dress was torn and stained, her hair hung in tangled waves around her thin face, and her hands were scratched and dirty from weeks of rough living. But her eyes were still intelligent and alert, and when she looked at him, Jake saw the spirit and courage that had kept her alive through an ordeal that would have broken most people. "You're really Jake?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with exhaustion and hope. "I'm really Jake, and you're the bravest woman I've ever heard of. How did you survive out here for so long?" Sarah began to cry then, not the gentle tears of a refined lady, but the raw, desperate sobs of someone who had been holding fear and loneliness inside for weeks. Jake moved slowly toward her, giving her time to retreat if she wanted to, but Sarah stumbled toward him instead, accepting the support of his strong arms when her legs finally gave out. Jake held her carefully, feeling how thin she had become and noticing the way she trembled with exhaustion and relief. She smelled like wood smoke and pine needles, and her clothes were damp from the morning dew. Most importantly, she was alive and safe, and Jake felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to his own eyes. "It's all right now," he murmured into her tangled hair. "You're safe. I'm going to take you home." As Sarah's tears gradually subsided, she began to tell Jake about her ordeal in a voice that was sometimes steady and sometimes broken by remembered terror. She described the attack on the wagon train, her desperate escape, and the weeks of hiding and surviving that had followed. Jake listened with growing anger at the men who had done this to her, but also with admiration for the courage and intelligence that had kept her alive. "I kept thinking about your letters," Sarah said, leaning against Jake's shoulder while he wrapped his coat around her thin frame. "They reminded me that someone was waiting for me, someone who would understand why I couldn't just give up and die out here." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I never stopped looking for you. Even when the railroad company said you had never bought a ticket, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it." Sarah pulled the battered journal from her pocket and showed Jake the letters she had saved. The papers were stained and worn, but she had protected them carefully throughout her ordeal. "These letters saved my life," she said simply. "When I wanted to quit, I would read about your ranch and remember that I had somewhere to go, someone who cared whether I lived or died." Jake examined the journal and letters with amazement. The fact that Sarah had managed to save these personal items while fleeing for her life spoke volumes about what they meant to her. He also noticed that she had continued writing in the journal throughout her ordeal, documenting her experiences with the same care and intelligence that had characterized her original letters. "You wrote through all of this?" he asked. "It helped me remember who I was," Sarah explained. "When everything else was taken away, I still had words. I still had thoughts and memories that belonged to me." As Jake helped Sarah gather her few remaining possessions, he marveled at the resourcefulness she had shown in surviving her ordeal. She had fashioned tools from stones and sticks, learned to identify edible plants, and created shelters that had protected her from the worst of the mountain weather. The refined schoolteacher from St. Louis had become a wilderness survivor through sheer determination and intelligence. But Jake could see that Sarah's strength was nearly exhausted. She needed medical attention, proper food, and weeks of rest to recover from her ordeal. More than that, she needed safety and security after weeks of constant fear and danger. "Can you ride?" Jake asked, looking at his horse Buck, who was grazing peacefully nearby. "I think so. I grew up on a farm, remember. It's been a while, but I haven't forgotten." Jake helped Sarah mount Buck, then walked alongside holding the reins as they began the long journey back to his ranch. Sarah swayed slightly in the saddle, her exhaustion evident in every line of her body, but she managed to stay upright through sheer force of will. As they traveled, Jake pointed out landmarks and told Sarah about his ranch, his animals, and the life he had been preparing for her arrival. He also asked careful questions about her ordeal, trying to gather information that might help the authorities track down the criminals responsible for the attack. Sarah answered his questions as best she could, but Jake noticed that she grew tense whenever the conversation turned to the possibility of pursuit or revenge. The weeks of fear and hiding had left deep marks on her spirit, and Jake realized that her recovery would take much longer than just healing her physical injuries. "They might come looking for me," Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight with worry. "They know I could identify them. They know I saw what they did." "Then we'll be ready for them," Jake replied with quiet confidence. "You're not alone anymore, Sarah. You don't have to face this by yourself." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Jake's ranch came into view in the valley below. The log house looked warm and welcoming in the golden light, with smoke rising from the chimney and the flower garden Sarah had inspired blooming near the front porch. Sarah stared at the scene with wonder and exhaustion. After weeks of sleeping in caves and hiding from every sound, the prospect of a real bed, hot food, and safety seemed almost too good to believe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's just like I imagined from your letters." Jake helped Sarah down from Buck and supported her as they walked toward the house. She was struggling to stay on her feet now that the adrenaline of being found had worn off, and Jake could see that she needed rest more than anything else. But as they approached the front porch, both Jake and Sarah heard something that made them freeze in their tracks. The sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop, coming fast from the direction of the main road. In the fading light, Jake could see riders silhouetted against the sky, and they were heading straight for his ranch with the kind of urgency that suggested trouble. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the rifle hanging by his door, while Sarah pressed close to his side with a look of terror that broke his heart. After everything they had been through to find each other, it seemed that their troubles were far from over. Jake Morrison stepped protectively in front of Sarah as the riders approached his ranch, his hand steady on the rifle he had grabbed from beside his front door. In the fading twilight, he counted 5 horsemen approaching at full gallop, their faces hidden in shadow but their intent clearly hostile. Behind him, Sarah gripped his arm with trembling fingers, and Jake could feel her whole body shaking with terror. "Get inside the house," Jake said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen pantry. Hide there and don't come out until I call for you." "Jake, those might be the men who attacked the wagon train," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They said they would kill anyone who could identify them." "Then they picked the wrong ranch to visit," Jake replied grimly. "I've been dealing with wolves and outlaws for 5 years out here. Go hide, Sarah. Let me handle this." Sarah hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between seeking safety and refusing to abandon Jake to face danger alone. But the sound of the approaching horses grew louder, and practical necessity won out over emotional impulse. She squeezed Jake's arm once and disappeared into the house, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Jake positioned himself on the front porch where he would have good cover behind the thick log posts and a clear field of fire across the yard. He checked his rifle and made sure his revolver was loose in its holster, then waited with the calm patience of a man who had learned that panic got you killed while preparation kept you breathing. The riders slowed as they approached the ranch, spreading out in a way that suggested military or outlaw experience. They knew how to approach a defended position, which told Jake that these were not ordinary drifters or desperate men acting on impulse. These were professionals who had done this kind of thing before. In the lead rode a tall man with a black beard and cold eyes that reflected the last light of sunset like chips of ice. He wore a long coat that bulged with hidden weapons, and his horse was a fine animal that had obviously been well cared for despite the hard riding. This was clearly the leader, and Jake focused his attention on him while keeping awareness of the other riders' positions. "You Jake Morrison," the bearded man called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I am, and you're trespassing on my land. State your business or move on." The man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Name's Caleb Briggs. I'm looking for something that belongs to me, a woman who ran off with some property of mine." Jake kept his expression neutral, though his blood was boiling at the casual way Briggs spoke about Sarah as property. "There's no stolen property on my ranch, and no women either except my housekeeper, who's been with me for years." It was a lie, but Jake delivered it with the calm confidence of someone telling the truth. He had learned long ago that the best way to deceive an enemy was to give them exactly what they expected to hear. Briggs studied Jake's face carefully, clearly trying to determine if he was lying. "Funny thing is, we tracked someone to this area, someone who's been living rough for weeks, heading in this direction. You sure you haven't seen anyone unusual?" "I see a lot of things out here," Jake replied. "Hunters, trappers, folks heading west, most of them don't stop to introduce themselves." One of the other riders, a younger man with nervous eyes and quick movements, spurred his horse forward. "He's lying, Caleb. I can smell a woman from here, soap and perfume and such." Jake cursed silently. Sarah had washed in the stream that morning, and despite her weeks in the wilderness, she probably did still carry traces of the refined life she had left behind. The nervous rider had a good nose and the kind of desperate edge that suggested he was more afraid of Briggs than he was of Jake's rifle. Briggs raised his hand for silence, and the nervous rider subsided immediately. It was clear that the bearded man commanded absolute authority over his followers, which made him even more dangerous than Jake had initially thought. "Tell you what, Morrison," Briggs said conversationally. "We're going to search your place, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding. You can cooperate and live through this, or you can fight and die for something that's none of your concern." Jake raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at Briggs, but making his intentions clear. "And I'll tell you what, Briggs, you and your men can turn around and ride away, or you can find out how good a shot I am with this Winchester. Your choice." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the yard, and Jake could feel the tension building like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Briggs was clearly weighing his options, trying to decide if whatever he was looking for was worth the risk of a gunfight with a well-armed man in a defensible position. The decision was made for him when one of his men, apparently growing impatient with the standoff, made a serious mistake. The nervous rider who had smelled Sarah's presence suddenly spurred his horse toward the house, drawing his pistol as he rode. Jake's rifle boomed in the gathering darkness, and the rider tumbled from his saddle with a scream of pain and rage. The man hit the ground hard but rolled behind a water trough, clutching his shoulder and shouting curses at Jake. "Next one goes through your heart instead of your shoulder," Jake called out, working the lever on his rifle to chamber another round. "Anyone else feeling lucky tonight?" The gunshot had apparently been a signal Sarah was waiting for, because Jake suddenly heard the back door of his house slam open. Instead of staying hidden in the root cellar as he had ordered, Sarah was clearly making her own escape plans. Briggs heard the sound too and gestured sharply to two of his remaining men. They immediately wheeled their horses around the house to cut off Sarah's retreat, while Briggs and the last rider dismounted to take cover behind a pile of firewood. Jake found himself caught in exactly the kind of situation he had been trying to avoid. He could not defend both the front and back of his house simultaneously, and Briggs knew it. The outlaw leader had deliberately provoked the gunfight to force Jake into an impossible tactical position. "Seems like your housekeeper is awful eager to run away," Briggs called out mockingly. "Most hired help wouldn't risk their lives for their employers." Jake ignored the taunt and tried to think quickly. Sarah was smart and resourceful, as her survival in the wilderness had proven. Maybe she had a plan that Jake didn't understand yet, or maybe she was simply panicking and making the situation worse for both of them. The answer came a few minutes later, when Jake heard the distinctive sound of his old shotgun being cocked somewhere behind the house. Sarah had apparently found the weapon he kept in the barn and was preparing to defend herself instead of just running blindly into the darkness. The sound was followed immediately by a shout of alarm from one of the riders who had gone around the house. "She's armed, Caleb. The woman's got a scattergun." Briggs cursed creatively and rose from his cover to get a better view of the situation. This gave Jake the opportunity he had been waiting for. His second shot took the outlaw leader in the leg, sending him sprawling behind the woodpile with a howl of pain and rage. "Kill them both," Briggs screamed at his remaining men. "I don't care about taking her alive anymore." But Jake's display of marksmanship had clearly shaken the outlaws' confidence. They had expected to intimidate a simple rancher, not face someone who could put shots exactly where he intended them to go. The wounded man behind the water trough was moaning loudly, and Briggs was clearly hurt badly enough to affect his leadership. Jake heard Sarah's shotgun boom once from behind the house, followed by the sound of a horse screaming in pain or terror. She had apparently scored a hit of her own, which evened the odds considerably. "This is your last chance to ride away," Jake called out. "Next time I won't aim for arms and legs." For several minutes, there was only the sound of wounded men cursing and horses moving restlessly in the darkness. Jake used the time to reload his rifle and check his revolver, preparing for whatever came next. Finally, Briggs spoke again, his voice strained with pain but still carrying authority. "This isn't over, Morrison. We know where you live now. We know what you're protecting. We'll be back." "I'll be waiting," Jake replied calmly. Jake heard movement in the darkness as the outlaws gathered their wounded and prepared to retreat. The nervous rider who had started the gunfight had to be helped onto his horse, and Briggs was clearly struggling to mount with his wounded leg. As the outlaws rode away into the night, Jake remained on the porch with his rifle ready, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Only when he was certain they were really gone did he call out for Sarah. "Sarah, it's safe now. You can come out." Sarah emerged from behind the house, carrying the shotgun with competent familiarity. In the dim light, Jake could see that she looked different than she had just an hour before. The terrified woman who had been hiding in the wilderness was gone, replaced by someone who had faced armed men and held her ground. "I hit one of their horses," Sarah reported matter-of-factly. "The rider went down hard. I don't think he was seriously hurt, but he won't be riding back here tonight." Jake stared at her with amazement and growing respect. "I thought I told you to hide in the root cellar." "You did, but I've been hiding for weeks, Jake. I'm tired of being afraid all the time. Those men came here to hurt us, and I wasn't going to cower in a hole while you faced them alone." Jake set his rifle aside and pulled Sarah into his arms, feeling the solid reality of her presence and the steady beating of her heart. The refined schoolteacher from St. Louis had revealed depths of courage and determination that went far beyond anything he had imagined from her letters. "We make a good team," he said quietly. "We do," Sarah agreed. "But Briggs was right about one thing. This isn't over. They'll be back, probably with more men." Jake nodded grimly. "Then we'd better be ready for them. But first you need food, rest, and medical attention. You've been through enough for one day." As Jake led Sarah into his house, he was already making plans for the defense of his ranch and the protection of the woman who had traveled so far to be with him. The outlaws had made a serious mistake by attacking them tonight. They had revealed their intentions and shown their hand, but they had also given Jake and Sarah something precious, the knowledge that they could depend on each other when everything was on the line. The house felt warm and safe after the tension of the gunfight, and Jake quickly built up the fire and began preparing food for Sarah. She sat at his kitchen table, still holding the shotgun, and watched him move around the familiar space. "This feels like a dream," she said softly. "After weeks of hiding and running, it's hard to believe I'm really here, really safe." "You're here," Jake assured her, "and I'm going to make sure you stay safe no matter what it takes." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew that their troubles were far from over. Briggs and his men would return, possibly with reinforcements and a more carefully planned attack. The next confrontation would determine whether Jake and Sarah could build the life together that had brought them both so far from their original homes. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of snow, reminding Jake that winter was coming fast. Time was running short for outlaws who wanted to settle their business and move on to warmer territory. The next few days would be critical, and Jake intended to use every hour to prepare for the battle he knew was coming. The morning after the gunfight dawned cold and clear, with frost covering the mountain meadows like crystalline lace. Jake Morrison stood on his front porch, drinking coffee and studying the approaches to his ranch with the careful attention of a man who knew his enemies would return. Beside him, Sarah Hartwell wrapped his heavy coat around her shoulders and tried to make sense of how dramatically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. "They'll come back today," Sarah said quietly, her breath visible in the crisp air. "Briggs isn't the type to let a defeat go unanswered, especially not with witnesses who can identify him." Jake nodded, impressed once again by Sarah's clear thinking under pressure. The refined schoolteacher had vanished completely, replaced by a woman who understood the harsh realities of frontier justice. "I sent a message to town last night," Jake said. "Buck Wilson, my nearest neighbor, is riding to Willowbrook to bring back the sheriff and anyone else who'll help, but it'll take at least 2 days for help to arrive." "2 days is a long time when you're facing professional killers," Sarah observed. "How well can you defend this place with just the two of us?" Jake smiled grimly. "Better than you might think. This ranch was built with Indian raids in mind. See those thick log walls? They'll stop most rifle bullets. The well is inside the house, so we can't be starved out for water. And I've got enough ammunition to hold off a small army if they're stupid enough to attack across open ground." Sarah studied the layout of the ranch with new understanding. What had seemed like a simple homestead was actually a carefully designed fortress, positioned to take advantage of natural defensive features while providing clear fields of fire in all directions. "You've thought about this before," she said. "Man living alone out here has to think about everything. Wolves, bears, outlaws, hostile Indians, claim jumpers, rustlers. The territory is settling down, but it's not civilized yet." As Jake spoke, he was checking his weapons and organizing supplies for what could become a prolonged siege. Sarah watched him work with competent efficiency, and she began to understand why he had survived and prospered in country that defeated most men. "What can I do to help?" Sarah asked. Jake paused in his preparations and looked at her seriously. "You can shoot, obviously, but more than that, I need someone who can think clearly under pressure, someone who won't panic when things get bad." "After 3 weeks in the wilderness, I don't think I panic anymore," Sarah said with quiet confidence. "Fear, yes, panic, no." Jake handed her the shotgun she had used the night before, along with a box of shells. "This belonged to my father. He always said a shotgun was the best weapon for someone who might have to fight in close quarters." Sarah examined the weapon carefully, checking the action and testing the weight. Despite her refined background, she handled the gun with growing familiarity. Her farm childhood had included hunting and predator control, skills that were coming back to her under necessity. "Jake," Sarah said hesitantly, "there's something you should know about Briggs and his men. During the wagon train attack, I overheard them talking about other crimes. They're not just robbers. They've killed families, burned out homesteads, and worse. They enjoy the violence as much as the profit. Jake's expression darkened as he absorbed this information. Then they won't be satisfied with just taking revenge on us. They'll want to make an example, show other people what happens to those who fight back. That's what I'm afraid of. We're not just fighting for our lives, we're fighting for our souls. As the morning progressed, Jake and Sarah transformed the ranch house into a fortress. They moved furniture to create barricades, prepared medical supplies for treating wounds, and organized ammunition for quick access during a fight. Sarah proved invaluable in this work, bringing a teacher's organizational skills to the grim task of preparing for battle. Around noon, Jake spotted riders approaching from the north, silhouetted against the snow-covered peaks. Through his spyglass, he counted 8 men this time, more than twice the force that had attacked the previous night. "Briggs brought friends," Jake said grimly. "Looks like he sent word to other members of his gang." Sarah joined him at the window, studying the approaching riders with calm attention. They're taking their time, staying out of rifle range while they plan their attack. That suggests they learned something from last night's defeat. Jake was continually amazed by Sarah's tactical thinking. Most women of her background would be hysterical with fear by now, but Sarah was analyzing the enemy's behavior like a military strategist. The riders stopped about half a mile from the ranch house, clearly visible but well beyond the range of Jake's weapons. Through the spyglass, Jake could see them gesturing and pointing, apparently discussing different approaches to the attack. "They'll probably try to surround the house," Sarah said. "Use the barn and outbuildings for cover, then rush us from multiple directions at once." "That's what I'd do," Jake agreed. "Question is, do we try to stop them from getting close or let them come and fight them when they reach the house?" Sarah considered this carefully. "If we let them get close, we'll be trapped inside the house with no way to escape if things go badly. But if we try to stop them at long range, we might run out of ammunition before help arrives." Jake nodded approvingly. Sarah was thinking like a born fighter, weighing options and considering consequences instead of just reacting emotionally to the threat. "I say we make them pay for every yard they advance," Jake decided. "Force them to expose themselves, make them work for every bit of cover they gain. Even if we can't stop them completely, we can hurt them enough to make them cautious." As the afternoon wore on, the outlaws began their advance with professional caution. They moved from cover to cover in small groups, using natural terrain features and the ranch's outbuildings to mask their approach. Jake and Sarah took turns watching different angles, calling out enemy movements and coordinating their defense. The first shots were fired when the outlaws reached Jake's barn, about 200 yards from the house. Jake's rifle cracked twice, and one of the attackers stumbled and fell behind a water trough, clearly wounded but still alive. "Good shot," Sarah called out from her position at the back window. "But they're moving around behind the barn. I can see 3 of them working their way toward the chicken coop." Jake shifted his position to cover the new threat, leaving Sarah to watch the front approaches. For the next hour, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the outlaws, trading occasional shots and trying to prevent them from establishing firm positions around the house. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, the outlaws' patience finally ran out. Briggs, apparently recovered enough from his leg wound to lead the attack, gave some kind of signal that sent his men charging toward the house from 3 directions at once. Jake's rifle spoke repeatedly, the lever action allowing him to fire as fast as he could work the mechanism. Sarah's shotgun boomed from the back window, and Jake heard her grunt with satisfaction as she scored a hit on one of the attackers. But there were too many outlaws coming from too many directions. Several of them reached the walls of the house, and Jake heard them trying to break down the back door while others attempted to climb onto the roof. "They're on the roof," Sarah shouted. "I can hear them walking around up there." Jake cursed and grabbed his revolver, knowing that the outlaws were probably planning to shoot down through the ceiling or drop dynamite down the chimney. The thick log walls that had protected them so far were useless against an attack from above. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted from outside the house, but it wasn't directed at Jake and Sarah. Through the front window, Jake could see muzzle flashes in the gathering darkness, and he heard men shouting in confusion and alarm. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, pausing in her reloading to listen to the chaos outside. Jake peered carefully through a window and saw something that made his heart leap with hope. Horsemen were attacking the outlaws from behind, their rifles spitting fire in the dim light. Someone had arrived to help them, though Jake couldn't see who in the confusion of the battle. The outlaws, caught between Jake's defensive fire and the unexpected attack from behind, began to retreat in disorder. Several of them were clearly wounded, and their coordinated assault dissolved into a desperate fight for survival. Jake and Sarah added their fire to that of the newcomers, catching the outlaws in a devastating crossfire that broke their attack completely. Within minutes, the survivors were fleeing into the darkness, leaving behind several bodies and all their confidence. As the gunfire died away, Jake heard a familiar voice calling from the yard. "Jake, it's Buck Wilson. You folks all right in there?" Jake opened the front door cautiously, his rifle ready in case this was some kind of trick. But the voice belonged to his neighbor Buck Wilson, who lived on a spread about 10 miles to the east. Behind Buck rode Sheriff Tom Bradley from Willowbrook, along with 6 other men that Jake recognized as local ranchers and townspeople. "How did you get here so fast?" Jake asked as he stepped onto the porch. "I thought it would take 2 days to bring help." Buck Wilson, a grizzled man in his 50s who had fought Indians and outlaws for most of his adult life, grinned as he dismounted. "Got your message last night and rode straight to town. Sheriff here was already organizing a posse to investigate some other attacks in the area. Turns out your lady friend isn't the only one who's had trouble with Briggs and his gang." Sheriff Bradley, a competent lawman who had brought peace to several frontier towns, stepped forward to shake Jake's hand. "Heard you've been harboring a witness to that wagon train massacre. We've been tracking Briggs for months, but we never had anyone who could identify him positively." Sarah emerged from the house, still carrying the shotgun but looking suddenly fragile in the lantern light. The adrenaline of combat was wearing off, and Jake could see the exhaustion and strain of the past weeks catching up with her. "This is Sarah Hartwell," Jake said, putting a protective arm around her shoulders. "She's the only survivor of the attack on Henderson's wagon train 3 weeks ago." Sheriff Bradley tipped his hat respectfully to Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for what you've been through, but your testimony could help us put Briggs and his gang away permanently." Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked the sheriff in the eye with quiet determination. "I'll testify to everything I saw and heard, Sheriff. Those men are animals, and they need to be stopped before they hurt anyone else." Over the next hour, as the posse searched the area for wounded outlaws and gathered evidence, Sarah told her story in detail. Her account was clear, precise, and devastating to any legal defense Briggs might attempt. She had witnessed not just the attack on the wagon train, but conversations about other crimes that would allow the law to charge the gang with multiple murders. Buck Wilson, who had been examining the bodies left behind by the fleeing outlaws, returned with grim news. 3 dead, including that nervous fellow who tried to rush the house last night. Briggs got away along with 4 others, but at least 2 of them are carrying lead." "Will they come back?" Sarah asked. Sheriff Bradley shook his head. "Not likely. Briggs is too smart to stay in an area where every lawman in the territory is looking for him. He'll probably head for Mexico or California, try to disappear until the heat dies down." As the posse prepared to leave, carrying the bodies and evidence back to town, Jake realized that his ordeal was finally over. Sarah was safe, the immediate threat had been neutralized, and the law was finally closing in on the criminals who had caused so much suffering. But more than that, Jake realized that he and Sarah had passed through fire together and emerged stronger. The woman standing beside him was no longer the refined stranger who had written letters from St. Louis. She was his partner, someone who could share both the hardships and the rewards of frontier life. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they watched the posse disappear into the darkness. Jake looked at her with love and admiration, seeing not just the woman he had fallen in love with through letters, but someone who had proven herself capable of facing any challenge life might bring. "Now we build the life we planned," Jake said simply, "together." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since her ordeal began, it was a smile of pure happiness rather than mere survival. She had traveled farther than she ever imagined, suffered more than she thought possible, and discovered strength she never knew she possessed. "I love you, Jake Morrison," she said quietly. "Not just because you saved my life, but because you helped me find out who I really am." Jake pulled her close, feeling the solid reality of her presence and the promise of their future together. Outside, The mountain wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of winter. But inside the warm ranch house, two people who had found each other against impossible odds began planning the rest of their lives together. The mail-order bride had finally arrived, though not in the way either of them had expected. She had come through fire and trial, proving herself worthy of the strong man who had never stopped believing in her. And together, they would build something lasting in the beautiful, harsh land that had tested them both and found them worthy of its gifts.